Hello students, here is the recording for blood vessels, which is part of the discussion we're having on the cardiovascular system. So I will be reviewing the 16 slides that are present here, and we'll essentially be looking at anatomy of the blood vessels, physiology, function, and how these two are suited to each other. And then we'll take a look at circuits and some other pieces of information. So this is one of two narrations for the cardiovascular system. And so in this image here, you essentially are looking at veins being demonstrated if you clench a fist. And so veins represent one of the blood vessels that we will be studying. So let's move on to the next slide. So the blood vessels that we will focus on are primarily arteries, veins, and capillaries. However, there are also two other structures, arterioles and venules, which enter our discussion. So let's start by going through the slide. So first we have arteries. Printed here in red because arteries carry blood away from the heart. That is a fact. Do all arteries carry oxygen-rich blood? The answer is yes, except for one. The pulmonary artery, which you will learn about, does not carry oxygen-rich blood. So for this reason, in most diagrams and textbooks, you will see arteries shown in red color and veins shown in blue, because when blood has a lot of oxygen in it, it appears bright red. And when blood has lots of carbon dioxide in it, so whenever it has lots of carbon dioxide, it's usually low, very low in oxygen. That blood appears darker red. It isn't blue, but it might appear blue beneath our skin. In arteries, the blood is flowing under high pressure. So arteries experience the highest blood pressure. So let's clarify what is blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force exerted by the blood against the walls of the blood vessel as it is traveling along. So when blood is pumped out of the heart, it goes into a major artery called the aorta, and therefore the aorta experiences the highest blood pressure in the circulation. But since arteries experience the highest pressure of all the vessels, this is the reason why if we want to measure someone's blood pressure, we will use an artery to make that measurement. And usually it's an artery in the arm, and all arteries in the body have names. And that one will be called the brachial artery, most often is used. Now, to prevent arteries from bursting under very high pressure, they have a structure which is very suited to their function. They have a lot of smooth muscle, which helps them to expand. So as blood is forced into an artery, the arteries usually undergo an expansion. And once the blood has kind of passed along the way, the artery recoils. That expansion and recoil is what we can feel as a pulse. So we will also be talking about pulse. There's one slide on pulse later. So in contrast, I'm going to go right to venules, because arteries and veins are like opposites. Veins, they are large vessels that bring blood to the heart. The blood is under very, very low pressure. Veins have the lowest pressure. And for this reason, veins of the leg, the pelvic region, the abdomen, because the heart is in the thorax, These veins have to transport blood back to the heart in the thorax under very, very low pressure and against gravity. So this could become problematic because blood can begin to pool in someone's lower leg, and you can see this as swelling in the lower leg sometimes. So one of the major differences between arteries and veins, apart from these two that I just mentioned, is that veins have valves. And valves in physiology, whether they're valves in the heart, valves in blood vessel, valves in the digestive system, all valves function to prevent their contents moving backwards. So valves help to keep a one-way flow, one direction only, of whatever contents is flowing through that vessel. So in this case, it will be blood. And so we will take a look at the structure of a vein in a minute. But because veins don't experience very high pressure, they do not require the same amount of smooth muscle. So they have little smooth muscle. What they do have is a larger lumen. The lumen is a space in which the blood travels. So arteries have a lumen, capillaries, all blood vessels have a lumen. But the lumen for veins is very large. And most importantly, veins all carry oxygen poor blood, what can be called deoxygenated blood, except for the pulmonary vein. So you have to remember those two exceptions. The pulmonary artery is an exception to all arteries carries oxygenated blood, and the pulmonary veins are an exception to the statement all veins carry deoxygenated blood or oxygen poor blood. So in this diagram here, we have blood flowing from the heart. It's going into, this is a generic artery. This is diagrammatic, but this is the way it works in the body. So blood is flowing into the artery. From the artery, to get to a vein, there's a structure between capillaries. So the capillaries are these many different branches that we see here, those are all capillaries. What comes between the capillary and an artery is this structure, the arteriole. So the arteriole is a branch of an artery that's a smaller artery, and it leads to a capillary bed. So we call this a capillary bed simply because it has many, many capillaries. Now, capillaries, their claim to fame is that they are exchange vessels. This is the word you want to remember. These are the vessels here in which gas exchange, for example, can occur, which is why you see part of the capillary is in red, because blood flowing here is oxygenated blood. And all of these capillaries that are closer to an artery. Once that oxygen is removed, because there's cells out here, cells of the tissue where this capillary bed is found. Throughout our body, we have capillary beds, because remember, all cells require oxygen and glucose for cellular respiration. And the only way they can get it is from blood. So oxygenated blood is also blood that is high in glucose. So both glucose and oxygen diffuses out into the cells. The cells, when they carry out cellular respiration, they produce carbon dioxide, CO2. That CO2 is toxic to cells. That CO2 must be put into blood so that it can be transported away and basically taken to the lungs so we can breathe out the carbon dioxide. That's the only way we get rid of carbon dioxide. So when blood has lost oxygen, it is called deoxygenated. But blood that has lost oxygen is also blood that has picked up CO2. So deoxygenated blood is carbon dioxide rich blood. It's full of carbon dioxide. But like I said earlier, the color of the blood changes, and so diagrammatically, we always represent this with the color blue. So this is why now part of the capillaries in this capillary bed is now shown in blue because of that reason. In some books, this entire structure is shown in purple because blue and red makes purple. And just to distinguish that it is different from blood flowing in an artery and a vein in terms of oxygen content. So capillaries branching off from the arterioles will have oxygen-rich blood, but that oxygen is going to be diffusing out into cells. And as the blood flows, it's going to pick up carbon dioxide coming from the cells. The process is diffusion, simple diffusion that you've learned about in Bio 1150. So now we see that all of the blood flowing to veins is now deoxygenated blood. It is now carbon dioxide rich. And that's the blood that is going back to the heart. Now, in terms of structure of capillaries, what will make diffusion and what will make exchange of substances, because it's both the gases and some nutrients that are exchanged, and waste also. So what would make it very efficient is to have a very thin membrane. So capillaries are actually one cell layer thick. They do not have smooth muscle. They do not have any other structure. They are one cell layer thick. So they're the smallest of the blood vessels, but they're mighty because without the gas exchange occurring, homeostasis is going to become very dysfunctional if we cannot have proper gas exchange and nutrient exchange and the picking up of waste from cells. Now, capillaries, when they're sending the deoxygenated blood to the vein, they send it through a small vein first, called a venule. So this would represent a small vein here, a venule. And venules tend not to have valves like major veins do. So if we think of the heart, if I do a little heart diagram here, and we think of how blood is flowing from the heart, it would be blood comes out of the heart, first flows to an artery, then it will flow into an arteriole, then it will flow into a capillary bed, so capillaries drained by venules, and venules send all that blood to veins, big veins, which send it back to the heart. So that's the path of blood flow from the heart and to the heart. We will expand on that as we learn more. So let's move on. So as the previous slide said, this is a one-way circuit. This image here on the right here is meant to give you an impression. It looks like, the veins that you find on a leaf. And it's quite similar because all of these structures that we see here, it may look like a sort of cobwebby, those are all capillaries. So the denseness of capillaries in any anatomical part of the body is staggering, actually. But when you think of it, it needs to be because every cell needs to be able to get oxygen and glucose and get rid of its waste. So here's a different diagram. So here is blood flowing into an artery. Then we have the branching to give us the arteriole. And here the capillary bed is shown in purple. So there's blood flow throughout the capillary bed. But all of these arrows are leading to a flow towards a venule, which is here, and then venule to vein, and this vein will take the blood back to the heart. So what we want you to appreciate is the anatomical differences here between arteries and veins. And the big difference is the thickness of this wall, because the thickness of that wall is based on the presence of smooth muscle and a little bit of elastic tissue. But notice that a vein does not have the same thickness. So both arteries and veins have an outermost layer, something called the tunica externa. Tunica just means tissue layer. Then they have a tunica media, which is the middle layer, which is here, which is very thick, which is very thin here. And then they all have an endothelial layer, which is simple squamous epithelium, which is exactly like the simple squamous epithelium that is present in capillaries. So there are 3 layers for an artery and 3 layers for a vein. Layers 1 and 3 are the same, but layer 2 is different. So here is the artery. There you can appreciate the thick wall that helps it to withstand high blood pressure. And veins, since they don't have high blood pressure, they can survive with a thinner wall. The other important anatomical feature is the size of the lumen. This is the width of the lumen, the space through which blood will flow for an artery. Notice how much larger, much larger is this diameter for a vein. So it is true that actually at any one time, much of our blood in our body is actually pooled in our veins. So veins actually sort of hold a lot of blood in them as the blood is flowing. On to the next slide now. And so this is another diagram again showing you an artery with its very small lumen and a vein. Now this looks squished, and it is squished because this is a photomicrograph, this image here, which means that a true tissue having arteries and veins had to be sectioned, cut. And just like when you sort of cut meat, you know, on a cutting board, you distort or you sort of damage it a little bit. This is what has happened here. So the empty space, that is the lumen, so that's represented by this sort of white space here. That's the lumen. This is looking narrow, but in reality it is not. It's just because of the distortion or the damage that happens when you try to make a slide. But it shows you the same information that we were talking about a little while ago. Now, apart from the larger lumen in a vein, you need to remember that veins have valves which prevent backflow of blood due to the low pressure. This is what a valve would look like. And that's showing you a valve that's closed. So how do valves work? Well, on this next slide here, valves are one mechanism that actually help veins return blood to the heart. Because a golden rule of blood flow is the volume of blood that is sent out of the heart should be the same volume that is returned to the heart. Blood that's returned to the heart, that volume is often referred to as venous return, the amount of blood returned by the veins. So valves can help with that. There's also another mechanism that helps. So this is mechanism number 2, and both are being shown here. And so this second mechanism is the skeletal muscles, which function like a pump. So let's take a look at this. So the muscles, so let's say this is your calf muscle, right? The gastrocnemius. Remember, you had to learn your muscles. So the muscle is relaxed, the valves are closed. Now, when the muscle contracts here, it puts pressure on this area here where we see a vein. So the vein has blood in it. The muscle is contracting, squeezing the vein. In squeezing the vein, it's pushing the blood upwards. So the blood is forced upwards towards the heart. The valves are open to allow that. However, once the blood is being forced out, the valves then close so that the blood cannot. We don't want any return in this direction. So the skeletal muscles throughout the body, but especially in the legs, they help. And so if you are, let's say you're doing guard duty and you're standing at attention, straight like a soldier, and you don't move for about half an hour, it's very possible that you could, faint because there isn't enough blood basically flowing around your body, especially to the brain, because blood, it can pool in the lower legs. So movement is usually important, and it is also a good idea, even if you're sitting, to get up, stretch, walk, move. It all helps with blood flow, and it also helps oxygenate the brain so you don't get tired. So valves perform this really important function. Now, unfortunately, as we age, just like everything else, valves are aging too, and sometimes they become very weak. And if that happens, you can see valves in legs especially bulging, and they're called varicose veins. So there is a way to help individuals who are suffering from that. But notice this word, one way. It's a one-way flow that we want the blood to go back to the heart. Okay, now we move on from our discussion about arteries, veins, and capillaries to a bigger picture. And the bigger picture is to talk about two circuits. One is referred to as the pulmonary circuit, and the other is referred to as the systemic circuit. And the focus here is the blood vessels that are involved and the pathway. So here we have the heart, and this is a very important feature for you to appreciate and remember. The right side of the heart and the left side of the heart are divided by something called a septum, which is just a division. But what it means is blood does not mix in the left side and right side of the heart. There is no mixing involved. So, and remember again, for diagrams, this is the right side and that is the left side. So the right side of the heart is shown here in blue. And I know we haven't studied the structure of the heart yet, but that is coming up. The right side of the heart here in blue means that all of the blood in this side of the heart is deoxygenated. It's full of carbon dioxide. So that's not surprising, because what we see is here's the largest vein in the body, the vena cava. There is an inferior vena cava and a superior vena cava. Those words meaning inferior vena cava collecting blood from the lower portion of the body, superior vena cava from head, neck, shoulders. But right now on this diagram, we've only got vena cava, and that is the major vein that returns deoxygenated blood to the right side of the heart. That blood is then going to be pumped. Now, this is very diagrammatic because I'm sure you know that in the thorax, the lungs are beside the heart. They're lateral to the heart. But for demonstration purposes, we've got the lungs appearing all the way up here, clearly separated from the heart to help us understand the pathway. So blood will flow from the right side of the heart into an artery called the pulmonary artery. This is the artery that is the exception. It's carrying deoxygenated blood because that blood has to go to the lungs. In the lungs, we have air that we breathe in that's full of oxygen, And so an exchange occurs in the lungs. That is one place of gas exchange. So we have an exchange occurring in the lungs, which is why we see capillary beds shown here. These are the capillaries of the lung and the lung capillaries. So the carbon dioxide from the blood will go into the lung tissue and we breathe it out. And the oxygen that's been in the lung, that goes into blood. So that the blood that's flowing away now from the lungs, that's being carried in the pulmonary vein, is oxygenated blood. So it's shown in red, and again, this is the only vein that carries oxygenated blood. That blood comes to the left side of the heart. So here's the left side of the heart, and it's shown in red, and the left side of the heart always is in contact with oxygenated blood. So this is the blood that now needs to go all over the body except for the lungs. So we will develop this a little bit more when we look at the structure of the heart. So it's important that you remember that the left side of the heart pumps blood to the rest of the body. The rest of the body is what's referred to as the systemic circuit. So the circuit we just went through from right side of the heart to the lungs, picking up oxygen, back to the heart, that is the pulmonary circuit. And the word pulmonary always refers to lungs. Systemic always refers to all around the body. So if someone says you have a systemic infection, it means that bacteria is probably in your blood and flowing around the body. Never a good thing. But that's what systemic means. So the major blood vessel that receives oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart is this one here called the aorta. And the aorta branches to give every single artery that we have in our body. Every artery in the body gets its blood from the aorta. Again, the only exception is the pulmonary artery. So what this diagram is showing us here is, for example, the upper body. Blood will flow into an artery, arteriole. These are capillary beds for the upper body. Remember, again, this is diagrammatic. So it's a simplified diagram to help us understand a concept or a few concepts. We will have venules and veins draining the blood away. All veins, with the exception of the pulmonary vein, send their blood into the vena cava. Let's take a look at the liver. So the liver isn't shown as an organ. Instead, the capillary bed found in the liver is shown here. And what do we see? We have a hepatic artery. Hepatic always refers to liver. And these are things that you should learn as you move along. Now, the hepatic artery will branch to give the arterioles. We have the capillary bed where gas exchange and nutrients exchange, etc. will occur. Waste products will be picked up. And then there is a hepatic vein that drains the liver. So all the major organs have a major artery and a major vein. And sometimes, it's a good thing, sometimes the artery and the vein have exactly the same name. So hepatic artery takes oxygenated blood to the liver. The hepatic vein takes deoxygenated blood away from the liver. And the hepatic vein will send its blood into the vena cava. Next, we have, for example, the renal artery. Renal always refers to kidneys. So there's the capillary bed for the kidneys. Same arrangement. Renal artery brings oxygenated blood to the kidneys. The renal vein takes deoxygenated blood away. And then the lower body, of course, has its own arrangement. So there's this one here that I skipped, and now I'll go back to it. So the hepatic portal vein is a very unique arrangement, and I'm going to talk about it now because it's an important concept that you have to understand, and since it's on the slide, I'll mention it. This is a portal vein, and a portal vein is a very unique. There are only two portal veins in the body. One is in the head, and the other one is here. And what a portal sort of circulatory system is blood is going to flow from one capillary bed to another capillary bed, like here. That's the portal vein right there. So this portal vein is carrying blood from the stomach, the intestines, etc. We are going to need to know this when we do the digestive system. So after we digest our food, usually the hepatic portal vein takes that glucose-rich blood to the liver. The liver has about 8 different functions in the body. So it's a very massive organ. And I'm not going to list its many functions now, but it has a role to play in the digestive system, which is connected to the formation of glycogen from glucose, which you met when we did the endocrine system. So the very last slide in this group of slides looks at the connection between the cardiovascular system and the 11 different organ systems in the human body. This is a concept that you should be thinking about. I'm sure I mentioned it before, as you learn more anatomy and physiology. So again, we study the organ systems individually because it's easier to understand. But at the end of this course, you should have a very good understanding of how all of these different organ systems interrelate. So one relationship, for example, between the cardiovascular system and the endocrine system is that the cardiovascular system transports the hormones that the endocrine system makes. That's one example. And then there are others. So the hepatic portal vein is not the hepatic vein. They're different. The hepatic vein takes deoxygenated blood away from the liver. The hepatic portal vein takes blood from the small intestines area to the liver. This is blood that is rich in glucose because when we digest carbohydrates, they break down to glucose. This is blood that is rich in amino acids because when we digest proteins, they break down to amino acids. However, lipids, which are broken down to fatty acids, are not transported in the hepatic portal vein. But when we get to the digestive system, we can talk about why. Now, a little bit more about what's happening in a capillary bed. So instead of looking at the large, massive capillary bed, we can take a look at one capillary. So essentially, this is the arterial end here of a capillary. This is the venial end of the capillary. By now, you should appreciate that the blood pressure at the arterial end obviously is higher because the arterial end here, the blood is coming from an artery, so it must be higher. So that high pressure at this end of the artery creates basically a situation where substances will move out of the artery. So what kind of substances? Well, the ones we just talked about, oxygen, glucose, amino acids, salts, etc. Cells, like this is a red blood cell shown here. White blood cells are also present, even though they're not shown. Platelets are present. They do not move. This is in a healthy individual. They will not move. So water also leaves. Because remember, plasma has a very large component that is water. So if all of these substances left, including the water, what happens now as you get to the venal end where the blood pressure is quite lower, much lower? Well, the blood pressure is lower, this is true, but at this end here you have these cells, and you also have plasma proteins, clotting protein, fibrinogen, albumin, etc. Bottom line is the osmotic gradient here, the ability of the inside of the capillary to pull water back in towards the inside of the capillary is very high. So water flows back in here, H2O. Now the interesting thing is not all of the water flows back in, because again you're being shown this capillary, but there are cells out here because this capillary is in an area where you have a tissue, so there are lots of cells there. So about 90 to 95% of the water flows back in. And what happens with the last 5% of the water? Well, that last 5% makes up a fluid that is always surrounding cells. It's called tissue fluid or interstitial fluid. It's a fluid that bathes cells, B-A-T-H-E-S. And we are going to have to talk about this fluid when we get to the lymphatic system, so that's why I'm telling you now. That fluid bathes cells. So cells are not in a dry environment. They're always surrounded by fluid. And yes, there's the movement across, a plasma membrane of water, etc. But that's essentially what's happening in a capillary bed. So it's a fairly busy place. One of the things I mentioned but didn't specify, so what are some of the wastes that might be coming from cells? And carbon dioxide, I think but what is urea? Urea is a waste product that's produced by the breakdown of protein. So urea needs to be gotten rid, and usually it is sent out of the body in urine. So that's a waste product. Next slide. Distribution of blood flow in the body. Well, I think I sort of said this. Do not memorize this slide, but you should know generally that the majority of blood is most often in our veins as opposed to arteries. A slide on pulse. So we already said that a pulse is generated, and here's the radial artery, which oftentimes is used, and you can do a pulse measurement. You just have to find your radial artery. The common carotid artery here is also used quite often, but there are other pulse points that, if a patient is lying in bed and well covered up, you could use sort of the lower limb to actually get a pulse. So the normal heartbeat for a healthy individual is about 60 to 70 beats per minute. That's clinically what's often quoted. Again, normal healthy person. So for a pulse, it's roughly the same thing, because the reason we can feel a beat, with the pulse beat essentially, is because the heart contracts, sends blood into the arteries. That in sending the blood to the artery has to expand, and then it has to recoil once the blood has passed and gone on its way. That expansion and recoil is what we feel as a beat, and that we can count. So every time we count a pulse beat, we're basically counting how many, the same contraction of the heart at the same time. Now, blood pressure, I can say a lot about blood pressure. So we have normal values for blood pressure, as I'm sure you're all aware. Doctors check this sometimes. But what this is showing you is a graph that often appears in textbooks. And on this side, we have the unit for how we measure blood pressure, which is millimeter mercury. So it's not millimeter per mercury. It is millimeter mercury. The symbol for mercury is H, uppercase H, lowercase g. And so on the x-axis here, first we have aorta, the largest artery. Then we have some elastic arteries, muscular arteries. So those are all arteries there with arterioles. And what this is showing is that the highest pressure is usually in the aorta and in some of the elastic and muscular arteries. But by the time we get to the arterioles, the pressure starts to drop significantly. So we see some words here, systolic and diastolic. Systolic is the pressure when the heart contracts. The ventricles contract more specifically. And diastolic is when the ventricles relax. So systolic would be the highest pressure and diastolic would be the lowest pressure. Now, again, you don't need to memorize this diagram, but you want to appreciate this information here, that the vena cava has the lowest pressure in the entire circuit. And you can see the significant drop-off once we get through capillaries. In fact, in the vena cava, the blood pressure is roughly 0. So this is why veins need help returning blood to the heart. And capillaries, oftentimes students think that because capillaries are just small vessels, they're one cell layer thick, they would have the lowest blood pressure. The blood flow, which is not the same thing as blood pressure. Blood flow is how fast the blood is moving from point A to point B. Blood pressure is the force against the wall of the blood vessel. So blood pressure does decrease in the capillary, and blood flow, which is not shown on this diagram, also decreases to allow for the exchanges to occur. But the veins and the vena cava, which is the blood vessel that is going to take the blood directly to the heart, that's the one with the lowest pressure. Now, you're probably going to ask me, do you need to know all of the names that appear on this diagram? And the answer is no, you don't need to. But there are certain arteries and veins that we like you to learn because they're helpful in understanding physiology. So we refer to them as major systemic arteries, which deliver oxygenated blood throughout the body. And some of these you will be able to remember because they are named based on their location. So for example, I said earlier that renal always refers to kidneys. So obviously renal artery would be the artery that's taking blood to the kidneys. Mesenteric always refers to the intestines, small and large. So let's start at the top. Vertebral sends oxygenated blood to the head and neck, and there is the vertebral. So try and just connect the text-based information with the diagram that we've given you here. Axillary refers to the armpit always. You can talk about axillary lymph nodes, means in the armpit. Axillary, now some of these will branch. So for example, here's the axillary, and the axillary will branch to give other arteries. I'm just mentioning that because in the arm, it's kind of easier to see this arrangement. Carotid refers to the head and neck. Subclavian. Now, subclavian, sub means beneath, you know, like a subfloor is beneath the real floor in your house. Clavian comes from the word clavicle. Clavicle was collarbone. So those of you who took the time to actually learn your bones and remember them well, now it comes in really handy. So subclavian, this artery is right below where the collarbone would be. And here we see the left subclavian right there. And you can see what I'm talking about. And again, when we get to the lymphatic and immune system, you will need to know where this subclavian vein is. So there's a subclavian artery and a subclavian vein. Brachial, because brachium means the upper arm, so we have a brachial artery. Ulnar and radial for the radius and ulna, which is in the forearm, so right there. Femoral, again, named because of femur, so femoral is thigh. Now, the femoral arteries are really important arteries, and if they're severed or cut, somebody could actually bleed out. Massive amounts of blood flowing in them. So very important. Iliac again, so from the ilium, so the ilium was that flared bone of the hip, so you would expect anything iliac to refer to this region here. So there's a common iliac, internal iliac, and external iliac, but just that iliac refers to hip you want to remember. And a closer look at the aorta. So the aorta has distinct regions, including the ascending aorta. So when the aorta leaves the heart, so to speak, and blood is pumped into it, right? Blood is going to be coming up this way, like that. So this part is referred to as the ascending aorta, and it has three major branches, which I'm going to put a circle around here, before it bends. So it looks like a cane and becomes now the descending aorta, so that it goes down the spine, the backbone, basically, with branches going off left and right. So several arteries will branch off the aorta to serve the upper body and the lower parts of the body. Now, small coronary arteries will branch off the ascending aorta to service the cardiac muscle of the heart. I'll remind you about that when we take a look at blood flow through the heart. But basically, the heart has to have its own circulation. Because think about it, when the heart contracts, the muscular part of the heart, which is really all of the heart, that is squeezed. And while that contraction is sending blood via the aorta to all parts of the body, none of that blood is actually flowing in the heart muscle itself. So when the heart relaxes, then blood actually flows into what are called coronary arteries. So contraction sends the blood into the coronary arteries, and as the heart relaxes, then the blood is able to flow in those arteries and basically oxygenate the heart muscle. So the heart is mostly muscle. This diagram here just allows you to see, like, the first branch is the brachiocephalic artery, which then branches to give you the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. And, you know, the right subclavian is going to be by the shoulder, thus the common carotid is going to go up the neck, very close to the face. There's a left common carotid artery, and then there's a left subclavian artery. So those are the three. Those three, yes, I think you should know. When it comes to veins, shown here in blue, we've sort of got the major ones would be the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. With the superior vena cava collecting blood, so deoxygenated blood, from the head, neck, shoulders, and bringing blood to the heart. And inferior vena cava would basically be everything, below the thoracic region, collecting all of that blood. So pictured here are the veins of the systemic circuit. And you can see we had subclavian arteries, so you can see that there's also subclavian veins. You've heard of the jugular, or you might have seen the jugular being punctured in movies. Well, I think everybody knows the jugular really is in the neck, etc. Here's the hepatic vein being shown again, the renal vein. So these are the most common ones that you would probably see on a test. We don't ask anything unusual, anything out of the way. The ones that we've mentioned, you should know. Veins of the upper limb. So this is important because in medicine, oftentimes we will use the brachial artery, which is not shown here. This is the brachial vein, but we use the arm for blood pressure measurements. But this one, the median cubital vein, which is also known as the antecubital vein, that information is right here. That's most often used for drawing blood, a process called phlebotomy. And here we can actually see veins that drain the upper limb. So blood is flowing in this direction in these vessels. The deoxygenated blood going back to the heart. And many of the veins are named after the bone along which they travel. So we have the subclavian again, the axillary, the brachial, the radial, and ulnar. And this is the last slide, connecting the circulatory system to other systems in the body. This is a really important slide for you to come back to after we have done all the other organ systems that are coming up. So far we have done endocrine. So I will leave it to you to read this, because if I started reading all of this, this is going to add another half an hour to my narration, and that was not the goal here. So muscular, when you read this, it should make sense. So look out for what connections can you make between what you've already learned. We talk about, for example, cerebrospinal fluid and so forth. What connection can you make between your past learning and this slide about the cardiovascular system? And here's skeletal. So these four. Integumentary is important. You should have covered integumentary in Bio 1150, but you probably did it in a very superficial way, but you can still read that information. So that's the end of the narration for me. I'll talk to you again.